Ms. Whalen, would you like to volunteer a comment? Okay, if you'd sit there, please.
I have a point of order. Assuming she volunteers a comment, is there an opportunity for questions?
Well, she's just providing a comment, but in the interest of fairness, I think that we should be afforded the right to cross-examine.
Well, then she needs to be sworn. It's not just a comment.
Well, at this point, she's going to have to be sworn.
Unless we do the same thing we did with Representative Clark.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Public comment, not cross-examination.
It's going to be, they're right. It's going to be public comment.
I'm going to place an objection on the record then because she's clearly an interested party here and not like Mr. Representative Kowalko, given that his parties are proposing send her agency.
Well, she represents a non-party. Representative Kowalko is a non-party. Let's go forward and hear her comment on behalf of her agency, and then we can go from there. You can make your comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners for hearing me today. Can you hear me? So I just want to say that DITO supports the recommendation in the chart for economic development, but we would request the flexibility to allocate funds towards a project that we believe would fit well in the overall mission of the settlement. The General Assembly, through this year's bond bill, identified the need to fund an innovation center, and if such project materialized and the funds were made available. And we envision a center that was a state-of-the-art research center facility aimed at fostering development of new technologies in areas involving renewable energy, energy efficiency, alternative energy, and natural gas tech as well, among other disciplines. And we believe that giving us the flexibility to fund this and be a partner, private-public partner in an innovation center would have an incredible, important effect on the Delmarva Zone customers as well as the state. It's stimulating innovation in this area. And so we request a little bit of flexibility to be able to allocate funds to this very well-worked project as well.
Would you be kind enough to spell your first and last name for the record?
I sure will. Bernice, B-E-R-N-I-C-E, Whaley, W-H-A-L-E-Y.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, since that was a public comment, I'm going to move to Chesapeake.
Thank you, Mr. Lawrence. Chesapeake Utilities supports the $6 million in funding for DITO to use to promote job growth in Delaware for the natural gas infrastructure project. I had noted in the opening statement that I was going to speak to one aspect. Actually, after hearing the comments, I'd like to speak to two aspects of that funding. First of all, the proposed three-year limitation on the projects. Chesapeake would assert that is an unnecessary limitation, and it could actually be harmful to particular projects that DITO deems as being in the public interest as far as economic development goes. For instance, if DITO saw fit to award a project at the natural gas transmission level, it could take a year and a half just to get through the FERC authority process, the FERC approval process for authority to build it. And so 3 years may just not be enough time. So I would ask that the Commission not restrict the funding in that way. The second aspect, and it's been touched upon here a couple of times so far, is whether it's going to be limited to Delmarva's service territory. Now, if you look at the matrix, the parties that support it reference Delmarva's service territory. If they're talking about Delmarva's natural gas service territory, then the limitation would be to projects in Newcastle County and essentially just above the canal. So I'm not sure if that's the service territory they're talking about, because if you heard Mr. Geddes speak on behalf of staff, he did reference the study that is being required for an economic development purpose for gas infrastructure in Kent and Sussex counties. And so if that's the support for this particular allocation, then Chesapeake would simply ask that the commission not restrict, from a locational point of view, that funding for DIDO. So we did hear that there's not sufficient record evidence for this, but really what could be more record evidence than the last order that was signed by the commission adopting the amended settlement agreement. Mr. Geddes mentioned that in paragraph 9, there's a requirement that the joint applicants conduct a natural gas study. And in that very paragraph, it says that the study would be in furtherance of Senate Joint Resolution number 7. SJR 7 was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor in 2014. And that resolution cites the blue-collar jobs task force that found a need for additional pipeline capacity in Kent and Sussex counties for purposes of job growth. So our ask is simply that you not put a locational restriction on that. Another way to look at this would be simply, if you're going to look at the, yeah, that's right. We've been talking about the public interest component of the merger statute. And staff even said we're trying to get across all citizens and hit all segments of the state. So it would really be an unnecessary restriction to limit this to Delaware service territory, especially if it's the gas service territory. Thank you.
Merrick.
Yeah, just a quick response, but notwithstanding our concern about the fact that this is applying to natural, or at least the proposals applying to natural gas for the first 3 years, and our concerns about that, Mr. O'Brien had actually talked about extending the natural gas piece out for the full 6 years of the program, I guess, or a further extension of the program. Sort of goes to my argument as to why then is renewable energy sort of relegated to the last 3 years when the money may be exhausted at that point. So, I mean, if the commission were to go with a 6-year program and include natural gas for the entire 6 years, then I think the reverse should be the same, where you're looking at renewable energy and energy efficiency projects within the state for that entire period as well.
Dr. Firestone.
A couple things. Just in response to Mr. O'Brien, he said that projects that DIDO sees as, quote, in the public interest, in my view, is that the question is not what DIDO sees as in the public interest, it's what you, based on the evidence in this record, find to be consistent with the public interest. It's your job to determine what's in the public interest and under this settlement and under your statutory authority, not DIDO's. The suggestion as well that we should be spending $6 million on natural gas infrastructure because we already have a settlement that says we should study it first makes no sense to me. We would need to have studied it first if we were already ready to put money towards it. So paragraph 9 in the admitted settlement agreement is very clear. In furtherance of that joint Senate resolution, the joint applicant shall conduct a study. So that would be the logical way to go. That's what you already said was in the public interest, not all of a sudden putting $6 million towards something that you already said we first need to study. I mean, this new proposal on an innovation center, maybe it's meritorious, maybe it's not, but again, you're not, it's as if there was $6 million in grants and DIDO's coming to ask you how to, what they would like you to give them money to do.
This isn't about DITO. This is ultimately about Delmarva customers.
Any other comments by any parties as to the DITO economic development issue? Chesapeake.
Thank you. Just a brief response. I mean, many people in the room know that the state has been performing these studies for years and years and identifying the challenge of expansion of natural gas in Kent and Sussex counties. And so to have the commission identify that challenge in one part of the merger requirements through this study, and then in another part of the merger requirements have a potential solution for that challenge, but then to say the two cannot overlap in any way because of these locational restrictions wouldn't be in the best interest of the state of Delaware. Thank you.
Any other comments as to this issue? Any questions from any commissioner?
Mr. Guinness, would you please answer and respond to Mr. O'Brien's comments about the Delaware service territories and why we shouldn't, as a commission, expand statewide due to the opportunity to look at the best opportunities statewide? Why should we just cut it off at Delmarva Power and Light?
Well, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, I think the reason why it was restricted to Delmarva's service territory is the connection with the reason why the funds are there in the first place. And also Delmarva has expansion plans as well for gas. So that was probably the initial reason. But if you accept staff's version that the public interest includes everyone, it would also include, obviously, expansion in other parts of the state, which I referred to in my comments before. So I think the commission is not necessarily bound by the words on the chart, Exhibit 54, if it felt that a broader interpretation should be used to invest these funds throughout the state rather than just Delmarva's service territory, which is primarily in Newcastle.
How about Mr. Burkett's observations about the renewable energy situation?
Well,
would it be better to have more parties in the game trying to win and put the best solution forward rather than just limiting it to natural gas infrastructure?
Globally, yes. But again, we were feeding off things that we knew. One, the sources of funds. Two, the interest by the governor and others in this. And those restrictions naturally came out of those, that information. However, looking at it anew, and as we discussed in our opening comments, the commission believes that it should not be restricted to gas or restricted to Newcastle County. That is your prerogative in determining what you believe the public interest should be served in the context of this discussion. So staff would support that as well.
Mr. Hearing Examiner, may I ask Ms. Whaley the same answer, respond to the same questions?
Yes.
She's going to need to be sworn now.
She could provide comment on that issue without being sworn.
I want to place a continuing objection on the record regarding her comments.
Can you comment on what you just heard?
On the discussion on whether it should be restricted to Delmarva customer area or expanded, and also on whether it should be gas related or other energy related.
Yes, both of those issues.
DITO we would support the ability to expand that to other related to the best projects that come along. Obviously, alternative energy, renewable energy, and energy efficiency projects are extremely important to the state, as well as gas, and I believe that having the flexibility to support those projects in the best way we can to create jobs, to create innovation, and to expand all those things in the state is very important to all of us.
And what about the issue of whether the gas infrastructure should be only related to Delmarva's territory, or also should be statewide and include Chesapeake's territory?
We will support whatever the commission obviously decides on this. And again, it is, I think, really important that we look at the areas that need it the most, and they may not all be in Delmarva areas.
Okay. Chair. Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any other comments on this issue by any party?
Mr. Hearing Examiner,
Yes.
just one quick comment on this issue, just for the benefit of the commission. One of the reasons we talked about this being limited to Delmarva's territory was the idea that if you had more gas customers, you'd have a larger base and you potentially reduce the costs for all Delmarva ratepayers. And that was part of the discussion that went into this. Just so you know, that was one of the issues that we talked about. I think maybe DPA might have raised that issue.
Questions, Mr. Hearing Examiner? So following up on that statement, Mr. Geddes, if these monies, for example, the $6 million were to go to investments in gas pipeline infrastructure, when rate cases come before the commission, does that reduce then the burden of the public utility to request retrieval of that capital from the commission and ratepayers? So if this $6 million, I'm sorry, if you understood the question.
Yes, I understand the question. I will give you the classic lawyer's answer. All other things being equal, yes, it would reduce the amount of the return, because it would be inappropriate if the source of funds was other than stockholder funds that supported the investment in capital that the company is trying to recover in rate base. It would be classic double dipping, where you have one source of funds that come in to support the capital, but now you're asking ratepayers to again support the same investment. Hopefully we wouldn't let that happen.
Thank you.
Any comment by any other party as to this issue? Okay, moving on to issue 5, which is the public interest issue. Mr. McGonigal, joint applicants.
Yes, thank you, Hearing Examiner Lawrence. This is a proposal for $4 million for public interest projects. The joint applicants believe that utilizing a portion of the MFN financial benefits for public interest projects, as staff proposes, is consistent with public interest. While such an allocation is necessarily less definitive than other proposed allocations, it does provide the Commission with a mechanism to potentially benefit from input and proposals from the nonprofit community and other educational institutions. We do think there's substantial evidence in the record to support this allocation, including but not limited to the amended settlement agreement itself, which provides for the joint applicants to maintain charitable distributions for a period of time, 5 years, not less than $699,000. There's testimony, joint applicants, Exhibit 8, Calvin Butler, who provided testimony concerning the importance of community initiatives and charitable giving at pages 12 to 15. Staff's Exhibit 1, Connie McDowell, also testified about expressing some concern that the joint applicant's commitment in terms of charitable contributions was not sufficient at page 12. And so we believe this proposal is responsive to those concerns, and that the evidence in the record articulating those concerns is substantial and supports this allocation.
Staff.
Thank you, Mr. Examiner, members of the Commission. This is staff's proposal, and there are some parties that support it, and there is one party that does not. We'll hear from that party after I'm finished. Staff, again, taking a global approach to the benefits that could be achieved from this merger, and specifically from the most favored nation, thought that the reservation of less than 5% of the total amount of money that will be allocated to the various agencies and through rate credits that reserving $4 million for other segments of the community, such as nonprofits, educational, for future funding, was something that was consistent with the overall public interest and Section 215. Staff does not read public interest to mean only Delmarva ratepayer interest, as our prior discussion with regard to DEDO and investment and whether it should be restricted to Delmarva territory or include other types of renewables or other types of fuel separate apart from natural gas, shows that there are many segments of the community that could benefit from this. And this is a small reservation. Staff believes it's important. Staff does not agree with the idea that the commission could not order or otherwise order Exelon to make this reservation and in the future determine whether there are needs that meet the criteria and exercise that right separate and apart from the parties that have participated so far in assisting you, I'll use that word generally, assisting you in determining how the benefits from this merger should be allocated.
Public advocate.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Examiner. Commissioners, I'd like to address up front a couple of things that Mr. Geddes said. First, the amount is not the issue here. It doesn't matter if it's $4,000 or $400,000 or $4 million. The issue here is whether the commission should be in the business of deciding which charitable organizations get money. Now, Mr. Geddes says that the commission could order Exelon to give out this money itself. I suppose it could, but I would note in that respect that in recent rate cases in which utilities have sought to recover their charitable contributions in rates, the commission has declined to allow that. And its rationale for that has been that ratepayers don't get to choose who gets the charitable contributions. So with that, finally, he says that there are many, and I think I got this quote right, many segments of the community that can benefit from this. Very true. And as we'll get into it, we have a problem with how you figure out which segments of the community might benefit from this. Now, the first reason that we disagree with the $4 million allocation is that we don't believe that this commission has statutory authority to conduct an RFP process and select public interest projects to whom it will distribute funds. The commission only has the authority that the General Assembly has given it, and there is nothing in the Public Utilities Act that gives the commission authority to distribute funds to public interest projects. The General Assembly has given authority to distribute funds to other agencies. You've already heard today about DENREC having the EEIF, but they have the statutory authority to do that. That's found in 29 Delaware Code Section 8030. And DEDO, Sections 5054 and 5055, also have authority to provide grants to various applicants. But there's no similar provision in Title 26. Clearly, the General Assembly knew how to give this commission authority if it had wanted it to have it, but it didn't. And although there is legal authority for the proposition that an express legislative grant of authority or power to an agency includes the power to do whatever is reasonably necessary to implement its power or authority, the Commission doesn't need the power to conduct an RFP process to satisfy its duty of ensuring that the allocation of funds is consistent with the public interest. It has never held that before in connection with any merger, and it didn't hold so in its order approving this merger. Secondly, even if the Commission had such authority, the proposal is too vague to be approved. There's very little detail in it. Missing are such important details as what public interests will be eligible to submit a bid, how will the bids be evaluated, what criteria will be used to evaluate the bids. Will the Commission review the bids, or will it delegate that responsibility to a subordinate? If so, to whom will the task be delegated? How will the Commission be sure that the subordinate to whom it delegates the authority has the requisite experience to evaluate bids and make recommendations? How will the Commission ensure that the subordinate doesn't have some personal interest or bias in favor of a particular project or bidder? Will unsuccessful bidders have a right to challenge the Commission's decision? The proposal is silent on all of these important questions. Third, the DPA is concerned about the potential for bias in the evaluation and selection process. Commission staff submitted supplemental testimony earlier in this proceeding that for the Commission to approve this merger, the public interest required the joint applicants to contribute $1.5 million to secure a site for a special needs children's camp. That is Exhibit S2 at page 1 and Exhibit CSM1. The joint applicants objected to that requirement, and other parties also made it clear that they did not support such a requirement. And that requirement didn't make it into either the initial settlement agreement or the amended settlement agreement that the Commission approved. The insistence that $4 million be set aside for unnamed public interest projects seems to be a way to allocate funds to this specific project through the back door. The DPA is not suggesting that such a project isn't worthy of support, but we're concerned that this project already has a foot in the door. Similarly, we disagree with Dr. Firestone's proposal, although I will say his is more detailed, but he proposes that his employer, the University of Delaware, evaluate RFPs for the solar and wind power academic research that he proposes, and that the university also be one of the academic institutions eligible for such a grant. We have the same concern about potential bias with that proposal. Finally, Marek and Dr. Firestone propose that money be allocated to renewable energy projects or studies, and we object to that as well. Renewable energy already receives generous funding from ratepayers' payment of costs that Delmarva incurs to comply with the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standards Act and from ratepayers' contributions to the Green Energy Fund. It will also, other energy issues will also be receiving ratepayer funding, or may possibly be receiving ratepayer funding as a result of the Delaware Energy Act and the energy efficiency programs that Delmarva will be required to put into place. For these reasons, the DPA urges the Commission to reject the proposal to allocate $4 million to public interest projects. If this $4 million goes anywhere other than directly to ratepayers, it should be allocated to DENREC's EEIF. If it goes there, it will reduce the amount that Delmarva ratepayers ultimately will have to pay for the energy efficiency projects that the General Assembly has mandated, and ratepayers will see some benefit from it. I'd like to address two other arguments raised in the comments that you've already heard. One is that residential ratepayers got $40 million in the first round of giveaways. In our opinion, they should have. Delmarva has more residential ratepayers than any other type of ratepayers, and ratepayers paid for the assets that are being purchased. So they should get something back because the shareholders did, and certainly many of PHI's executives did. And you've also heard that low-income ratepayers should get more than they're getting. I think, and if I'm quoting Dr. Firestone incorrectly, I apologize, but I think I heard him say that the DPA opposes money to low-income ratepayers. Nothing could be further from the truth. We recognize that high energy costs are a burden on low-income households, and that is precisely why we insisted on funds both in the amended settlement agreement and in the allocation of the MFN to offer relief to those customers. In the amended settlement agreement, the settling parties proposed and the Commission approved rate credits that also benefited low-income households, and it also included debt forgiveness for low-income households. Under the MFN proposal to which staff, the joint applicants, DENREC, and the DPA have agreed, and you'll hear about this a little later, $3.1 million is being allocated to arrearage forgiveness. So low-income households have not been left out of consideration, at least from the DPA's perspective. So the DPA urges the Commission not to allocate $4 million for unidentified public interest projects. Thank you.
Denrick?
Yes, Mr. Hearing Examiner. DENREC supports the public interest proposed allocation as promoting exciting, innovative opportunities in energy. Thank you.
Merrick?
Yes, we don't oppose the $4 million allocation. What we do, we are concerned with the fact that this is not detailed, similar to the concern that DPA just raised. The fact that just by using the words public interest, you could fit a lot of different things under that determination. So the reason why we think it should be renewable energy projects is because we do think that based on Delaware law, there's a great preference by the legislature to these types of things. And so we think it's very important that something, at least some very specific definition of public interest is created. Now, I do want to respond to the EPA's concern saying, well, there are some renewable energy provisions in this agreement or in these allocations and energy efficiency, and maybe this is not the appropriate place to do it. I disagree with that. When, for instance, Delmarva is doing its IRP, one of the provisions in the statutory authority, I can't name it off the top of my head, discusses the fact that you should be looking at energy efficiency and renewable energy as the first choices when looking at resources to meet the IRP. I mean, there's obviously other factors that you look at in that process, but I think it's very, very reasonable to be looking at renewable energy in this particular case for that reason.
Dr. Firestone.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Examiner, members of the Commission. I generally don't oppose the notion of a $4 million public interest fund. I think it should be much more neatly tailored than the proposal, and so I join in that regard with Mr. Burkett and Ms. Iori. I proposed that $500,000 go to paired, and by paired I mean you put two together, electric vehicle charging stations that would be deployed around the state, plus it would provide for a period of time during which charging would be free. Presently, we're really in a catch-22. Consumers don't want to buy electric vehicles because they're concerned about range anxiety and there's not enough charging stations. Investors at this point don't want to invest in charging stations because there's not enough electric vehicles on the road. So this is really an opportunity and really one of the areas where government can most effectively use its tools to move forward this kind of endeavor. So that's the first. In addition, I propose that the other $3.5 million go to wind and solar academic research or training at one of the three state universities. So why do I say that? One, as Mr. Burkett said, there's certainly an emphasis in Delaware law on renewables. Those are the renewables that are potentially viable. We're working on a report, which we hope to release in the next few days, that will show that even at 50% debt financed, you're going to be able to build, should you so desire, with more modern wind turbines, you could deliver electricity at a levelized cost of energy of $76 a megawatt hour. So there are some opportunities here in Delaware. There's other work to be done. I also specifically put in the requirement that there be a 20% match from the state institutions, so that adds an additional $700,000. So they would have to come up with 20% with whatever money came out as far as an individual researcher. That also shows that there's skin in the game, so you should get better projects. In addition, there's a cap on the overhead costs that can be asked for. Again, that assures that the money is going to be well spent. I did say that I would try to get someone at UD to administer this, not because I'm interested in self-dealing, but as to address another criticism that this was going to be loosey-goosey and was going to cost the state a lot of money to hire out a contractor to run an RFP. There are people at the university who are experienced in running RFPs, including, and this gets to the conflict of interest, I know it very well, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration gives my college several $million in grant funds. It then runs competitions with the federal money and then disperses grant funds. So we have ways of dealing with conflicts. I'm involved in the Lewis wind turbine. There are revenues for that. We have to deal with conflicts in these contexts, and I am certainly willing to not take basically any money that potentially would go to me. I just will forego. So I do this routinely in the context of money coming from the Lewis wind turbine. I don't put any of it towards summer salary, and we have to sign conflict of interest agreements whenever we have a potential conflict of interest. So we're used to dealing with this. Again, it's not critical to the proposal. I just said I would try to help, and so that we could run this and run it efficiently. And I also think if we do it narrowly, as I suggested, to wind and solar research and training, we can run it much more efficiently, because in order to do a request for proposals, you have to have expert outside reviewers. If it's this broad public interest, you need to bring in a lot of different reviewers to get the expertise to review the proposals. If it's more narrowly focused, it's much easier to run and to bring in experts to be able to review. We would certainly have an external review panel separate from the university that would be making the recommendations in any event. I think this would be a good use of $4 million, but I think it can be better used and better tailored if we put some of it towards electric vehicle charging stations and others towards a more narrowly focused purpose. Thank you.
Any comment by any party?
Yes, Mr. Hearing Examiner, I would just like to comment on Dr. Firestone's allocation, $500,000 for the electric vehicle charging stations. This allocation is duplicative of DENREC's efforts in this area. DENREC already has a program in place, $2.4 million initiative for alternative fuel vehicles. $500,000 of that goes towards electric vehicle charging stations. So it's DENREC's position that allocation for those additional charging stations isn't necessary.
Mr. Examiner?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Would I have an opportunity to briefly comment on that?
Yes.
Just briefly, there's one central question at 50,000 feet. What you've heard is a lot of scurrying around at ground level. The only issue that why staff put this in here is without it, you will have allocated all the funds in various ways that have been discussed. And the question for you at 50,000 feet, do you want to reserve any of that money and not allocate it through this process right now? And maybe retain it for maybe additional funds in the same area or for other worthy projects? That's the real question. Now, why would staff has created an RFP, it has been circulated, it's not in front of you, but staff knows how to run RFPs, we run them all the time, and we ask you to approve them for outside assistance. The point is, if the commission doesn't want to do this, then staff is not going to put in all the time and have all the I's dotted and T's crossed that's been suggested by everybody else, only to have the commission say, no, we don't want to do it. So no, there are no particulars. It's a list of imaginary horribles. I mean, if the commission is interested in reserving some funds for other public interest programs, then we will address these issues. But if the commission is not, then we did not want to expend that time and effort to create something that you may not think is appropriate. So I take the issues at a higher level than perhaps some of the discussion that has you've heard with regard to this.
May I
Yes.
make a brief rejoinder?
Yes.
Thank you. I think, unlike my colleague, Mr. Geddes, I don't think this is a 50,000 feet issue. I do think this is a closer to the ground issue. This is a proposal to give $4 million to, quote, public interest projects, end quote, that are unidentified. I think it's interesting that staff's already drafted an RFP for this. That was news to me. Yes, staff does draft RFPs for outside consultants, but it does not draft RFPs and has no experience, as far as I know, in selecting charities to recommend to the commission. Thank you.
Commissioner.
I have a question for Dr. Firestone.
Yeah.
The 20% matching fund you're talking about, for example, and suppose we accept your concept, will the 20% come from the university budget or from another grant, federal or state grant?
It could not come from another state grant. It potentially could come from a federal grant, or it could come from university funds, but not from another state entity. So what we typically do would be we might instead fund the graduate student through another source of funds, or we might donate some faculty time, so we wouldn't bill faculty time. Instead, that would be on the university line. There are other ways that you might come up with match as well. The match in the 20% is a minimum, so people are incentivized to bring as much match to the table as they can. That's evaluate in the context of the RFP when you get grant proposal, what the match is and the quality of the match and how much the match is evaluated along with the quality of the work product.
And if the money comes to you, for example, according to your concept, will you charge, or do you charge currently any of the administrative overheads to the grant fund so that the university budget goes to zero sometimes? Does it happen ever?
I specifically put in a limitation of 38%, which is the limitation that we have, the university has when it gets grants from the state. It's when it gets grants from the federal government, the overhead rate is 56%. So to a certain extent, in addition to that's its real operating costs, and so in addition to the 20%, effectively the university would be required to forego 18% of overhead that it's actually costing it. So the overhead rate is negotiated with the federal government. They go and look in and examine what exactly are the overhead costs for staff and heat and electricity and benefits and all. Actually no benefits are aside, but all those other things, they go in and calculate that, and it's a negotiated rate.
100% money will not go towards the program, but if we allocate to other other concepts, for example, as the staff recommended, and if the commission administers the program, maybe 100% will go towards the program, because commission may not charge the overhead.
Well, most people, many entities would not submit proposals unless they can get their overhead. That's part of the cost of doing business. In order for me to be able to do my work, I need electricity, I need an office. That's part of the cost of doing the work. And so many entities would require the overhead as well. It doesn't mean that with the 20%, part of the way you can make the 20% match would be just forgive, or basically take even less overhead costs than the 38%. So you might knock that down to 18% or something. So there are various ways that people use to get match, but it affirmatively requires the entities, and it's not just the University of Delaware, it's Del Tech, and it's not just for research, it's for training. They're all required to bring some of their own resources to the table.
Commissioner Gray.
Thank you. So for the parties that support this, to provide for qualifying public interest projects, which are heretofore unqualified in this forum, it seems for me a little contradictory. Is there any definition of qualifying on the table?
No, there's no definition of qualifying. We've given you examples of some of the types of agencies or organizations, non-charitable, non-profit, that or educational that might come under this provision. But again, as I said in my last comment, it's more a reservation with details to be worked out later. And that's the way it's being proposed, and the Commission should consider it in that way.
Thank you.
Chair.
How about if we decide that we like the concept, but there's not enough information here as the DPA and others suggest, and we look somewhere else to put the $4.0 million? Who would staff be advising us to put the $4.0 million in that case?
Staff hasn't made a recommendation on that. The only one who has is the DPA, and recommending that the $4 million be moved to the second category of expense.
So you don't want to opine on that now?
Not without talking to my client. If you'd like me to talk to my client, I'd be happy to. I usually don't trade policy without speaking to my client. I'm not, but I would need a 5-minute break.
Along those lines as well, Mr. Geddes mentioned previously, this question's for Mr. McGonigal and Mr. Shaw, that funds, there could be a case where funds were not allocated. Not all of the funds were allocated. And my question is, the funds will be held in an endowment fund, the $27 million. Theoretically, those funds are not spent on day one or potentially in the first 3 years. Is that going to be in a managed fund or in a money market fund? And in that case, where does the interest go?
What we've discussed, and it's not spelled out in the chart, but what we've discussed is, to the extent people would want us to do it, we would create a restricted account that could be drawn upon, and I think we've agreed that any interest that would be earned in any restricted account would accrue to whatever program was in place, Commissioner Drexler. And I'm not sure if your question related to this, but we also have talked generally, and it is in the chart, that there would be a reversion back for money that's not allocated. I think I heard Mr. O'Brien say, and several people said that this amount of time wouldn't be long enough, but at least the concept that we had in the discussion among the parties was that there would be funds would be allocated to a specific project, and if they weren't allocated after 5 years, it would all revert to the arrearage management program, which would benefit people with arrearage problems, because at least the thinking of the group was that's always a need that's going to be there, and that money will eventually be spent down.
So that would include the interest, I'm assuming. And so I think then the bigger question is, will it be a managed fund? Or, I mean, is this going to be invested in a money market account? I mean, where it's $27,000 interest in the first year, or is it going to be managed because it's such a large sum of money where it could generate 4% a year, and that difference is, could be up to $1 million? Is that potentially going to be managed and invested, or is it going to stay in money market?
From what I understand, and Commissioner, there hasn't been a lot of discussion among the parties, so I'm just speaking for the joint applicants. It would be in a highly secure account, such as a AAA money market, AAA federal T-bill type account.
Okay.
It wouldn't be invested in risk or growth securities or things of that nature. But again, I'm just speaking for the joint applicants on that issue.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comment by any party? Okay. Dr. Firestone, did you make all the comments on the electric vehicle charging issue that you wanted to?
I mean, my only comment is that I've never heard of the $500,000 fund before from Denver to electric vehicle charging. So that would be a nice addition, but I've never heard of it before.
Okay. Let's move on to the issue of low-income customer rebate, which is Dr. Firestone's issue.
Thank you. And I'll try to be brief. Some of this has already been covered in some of my earlier comments. So I suggest that $10 million be allocated to low-income customer rebates, $7 million to the lowest quintile, and $3 million to the next lowest quintile. Just to clear up something that was discussed earlier, I did not say that DPA doesn't support money going to low-income customers. I did say that DPA opposes my proposal to send $10 million of the $27.1 million to low-income customers. They certainly don't support my proposal. They support it going to other causes. So that was the genesis of that comment. As I noted earlier, low-income ratepayers, they pay a higher percentage of their income towards energy. And, this is based on, information from the CBO. And my view is that addressing energy equity, it's about fairness. It's not about welfare. Again, if we're going to move towards a more and more renewables, it looks like the prices are starting to get in line, and we may actually be able to do it without economic effects. But we know so far there have been some economic effects, and so dealing with those is something that we should turn our attention to. And we again know that economic benefits that accrue to low-income ratepayers are going to bounce through the economy because they're going to spend the money. And this is not just me. There were also statements by the joint applicants, testimony, the pre-filed testimony by Dr. Susan Kearney. I agree it may be administratively difficult. I did put a 5-year lapse on it. But there are ways, and I would suggest that if this commission were to allocate $10 million, that people in the General Assembly would figure out a way, if it can't be done explicitly now, they would figure out a way how to get it done, how to get that $10 million to our low-income citizens. So we do know that you can do these kinds of things through tax rebates, and so you may have to make some adjustments. You may need the General Assembly to sort of step in and make some adjustments to the tax code in order to provide the rebates through that if Delmarva Power is not able to identify those individuals. But the fact that it may be difficult and it may take some effort isn't a reason not to try it. If we're not able to do it at the end of the 5-year period, then the money could just go as a general rebate. The other advantage of this low-income customer rebate is that it would apply to both gas and electric customers. And so we'd be benefiting both electric customers and natural gas customers with this. So that's, my basis, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Any comment by any party? Okay, moving to the next issue, which is arrearage management plan. I see that the parties have all agreed on this issue, which says $3.1 million jointly developed approach to improve bill payments with potential additional reversion funds after 5 years. Mr. McConicle, joint applicants, any comments?
Thank you, Hearing Examiner Lawrence. Just that there is substantial evidence to support this allocation There's testimony from Sue Tierney, joint applicant 7, DPA 2 from Glenn Watkins. He provided testimony concerning delinquent and consumer payment arrearages and the need to address these issues. So again, there's significant evidence in the record to support this allocation, and we support it.
Staff,
No additional comments, thank you.
DPA,
No additional comments. Thank you.
Denrick,
We support the plan. We don't offer any additional comments.
Merrick,
No additional comments.
Dr. Firestone,
No additional comments.
Chesapeake.
No comment.
Too bad they're not all that way.
I have a question.
Commissioner Gray.
Sorry, everyone. I just need to know, you normally are carrying a current posting on your balance sheet for uncollectible bills. And I'm interested to know, is this 3.1 in addition on your balance sheet, or is it simply displacing 3.1 on your balance sheet?
So it's for customers that are about to be disconnected. Commissioner Gray, this is for customers who are about to be disconnected, and it helps them manage their bills going forward. That's the way this program is envisioned. Doesn't quite answer your question.
Sure, that answered the question. But if you're saying that you have different postings for these two different purposes, then you've answered the question. But if you have one posting on your balance sheet for uncollectible bills, and you're replacing 3.1 with this money, that's what I'm asking.
All right. Clarification? Sure. It is a source of funds to help with people who are in trouble with their bills and are being disconnected. The issue for the company is to determine how best to use these funds and who should get the assistance. This is not on the balance sheet. These are going to be funds that will be used by the company, Mr. McGowan, correct me if I'm wrong, or Mr. McGonigal, to assist those who are truly in need and either have been cut off or are about to be cut off.
Okay. That's acceptable. No further questions.
Any other comment by any party? Okay, moving on to the next issue, reversion of funds. Joint applicants, Mr. McConicle.
We support this proposal, and as has been indicated, the idea would be that these funds, if there's any reversions, would go to the arrearages program. That's an ongoing issue that we think these monies could be utilized for.
Staff.
No additional comment, thank you.
DPA.
No additional comments.
Denrick.
No additional comments.
Merrick.
No additional comment.
Dr. Firestone.
No additional comment.
Chesapeake.
No comment.
Any questions? Chair.
Would someone be able to tell me the approximate amount of the present arrearage figure on the books with Delmarva?
Question has been asked. Clarification. Asked and answered. No. But it has not been.
Mr. Chairman, 2.1 million for 2 years and 1.1 for 3 years.
Thank you, Mr. McGonigal.
Okay, any other comment by any party as to this issue of reversion of funds? Okay, hearing none, let's move on to the next issue, which is renewable investment. Joint applicants, Mr. McConicle.
Yes, thank you, Hearing Examiner Lawrence. This particular provision is a little bit different. All parties are in agreement with a proposal that joint applicants make available $3 million in capital to be provided at market rates for government agencies for renewable development. This is an appropriate MFN condition. It is designed to match what the joint applicants agreed to in D.C., and it simply mirrors that provision that was in D.C., and there is substantial evidence in the record to support this allocation as well, including testimony from Peter Bradford and Professor Firestone.
Staff?
No additional comments on behalf of staff.
Public advocate?
My only additional comment is that I believe it's not listed here, but the $3 million is not to be recovered from Delmarva ratepayers.
Merrick? I'm sorry, Denrick?
Denmark supports this provision of helping public agencies fund the needed capital to move forward with renewable energy investments.
Merrick?
We totally support this. Just one clarification. We just recommend that there be more information to further define the criteria. I mean, what's considered renewable. I mean, I don't want it's a delicate issue, but fuel cells that are generated by natural gas are not renewable energy. So I just think there needs to be some more clarification.
Specifically defined already in the Delaware Code.
Dr. Firestone?
I would concur on the comments by Mr. Burkett.
Chesapeake?
No comment.
Commissioner Gray?
One clarifying question. Are government agencies all inclusive? State, federal, county, and municipal?
Looking at the D.C. order right now.
That should say city.
All right. The language is that it's creditworthy governmental entities at market rates. Not sure right now whether that applies to federal agencies and the like, but it's something we can.
But would, in this case, the agreement by the parties intend for that to be specifically to certain governmental agencies or to all?
Commissioner Gray, that language was adopted straight out of the D.C. order. I believe in D.C. there are other governmental agencies that are not the federal government, for instance. We might have local governments. In our view, or in my view, it hasn't been discussed in detail amongst the parties. We just basically added in what was a provision of the D.C. order. But my understanding is it would be probably local governments that might have an interest in developing renewable capacity and renewable resources.
Any further comment by any party? Okay, let's move to the next issue. 5 megawatts, commercial renewable energy generation. Joint applicants, Mr. McConicle.
Yes, this also is an MFN condition that comes into Delaware because it matches the obligation that was made in D.C. And we've essentially barred the exact same obligation that they made in D.C. that we made in D.C. for Delaware. And again, there's substantial evidence in the record to support this allocation as well. The one issue I think that is being debated a little bit is how this will work, and our position is that this provision does need to mirror what was committed to in D.C., and so modifications in that regard, are more limited than some of these other allocations. We're agreeing to do what we did in D.C., and that's why this provision comes in.
Would you explain, for the record, the term merchant versus the term commercial that's been put forth by Merrick?
The way we understand merchant, it means that this will not be paid for by ratepayers. I'm not sure exactly what Merrick's referencing either.
Okay. And if there's agreement, we can move on.
Well, there is a total agreement.
Okay.
I use different.
Okay, we'll get to you. Any other comments from the joint applicants?
Not this time, Your Honor. Thank you.
Okay. Staff?
No additional comments.
Public advocate?
No additional comments.
Denrek?
DENREC supports this provision as a way to promote the development of renewable energy capacity in Delaware.
Merrick?
We support the provision for the same reason Denrek just said. The only thing we would suggest that could be done differently would be to allow for some kind of, and maybe this is where you were going with the merchant versus another methodology, but the would be some kind of maybe a competitive procurement, and maybe limit the participation of Exxon. This is so you can get, they could participate if it's a competitive procurement at arm's length. An affiliate could do that, but I would strongly recommend against just having Exelon build this. I think it would be much better to promote some kind of competitive procurement out of this.
Dr. Firestone?
I support the proposal as explained by the joint applicants.
Chesapeake?
No comment.
Commissioners?
Do the joint applicants have any objection to having the word competitive be placed in front of development?
I think we would, Mr. Chairman. The way that this was envisioned and the way it was created in the D.C. order is Exelon, or actually Exelon's market affiliate, is going to go out and find a customer and develop, I believe it's 7 megawatts in D.C. That translates to 5 megawatts in Delaware. And it's understood, and it's in the agreement that was adopted in D.C., that Exelon's affiliate is going to own the generation, sell the generation. This is the non-regulated side of the business. Exelon's affiliate, probably Constellation, is going to go out and find the customer and do the project and be the developer of the project. That was what was ordered in D.C., and that's what we would ask that be ordered here.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comment by any party? Okay. Microgrid. Joint applicants?
In terms of microgrids, where I think we all landed on this issue was that the joint applicants are going to be working in Maryland and D.C. on this issue, and I think we came to the conclusion that it'd be better to not be a leader but a follower here, and that what we were going to do was to see how things go in those jurisdictions and then come back and hopefully learn from those experiences here before we made any significant commitment in terms of moving forward. And I think that's where we ended up as the interested parties in this discussion, and that's what I think this chart represents.
Staff?
Yes, I agree with Mr. Donovan on behalf of the joint applicants. prayer that we don't want it to be the first state, but in this particular occasion, we thought that maybe learning from DC and other jurisdictions might be helpful as to how we want to proceed.
Public advocate,
No additional comments.
Denrick,
Denrick supports this provision.
Merrick,
We support the provision.
Dr. Firestone.
The District of Columbia and other jurisdictions have a lot of people who are really passionate and dedicated on this issue, and they're knowledgeable, and it makes perfect sense for us to defer.
Chesapeake,
No comment.
commissioners. Okay, the last section of the matrix is miscellaneous wording changes. It says, agreed to proposed order with additional MFN language changes, except Dr. Firestone said no objections, but joint applicants, do you want to make any comment on this section?
Yes, just briefly, Hearing Examiner Lawrence, we had, most of this has been back and forth with Mr. McGonigal, myself, and staff counsel and the public advocate. There were a number of provisions that were adopted in other jurisdictions that staff or DPA wanted the benefit of, and what we've done is we tried to align everything so that the joint applicants and Exelon and its affiliates have one set of rules to follow that are basically the same across jurisdictions. When we filed our submission, we included as Exhibit B a proposed order that would basically implement those things. We've shared it with the parties, and we think that's sufficient to basically make the same commitments that we're making in Delaware and in other jurisdictions to align everything and make them uniform. And as Mr. McGonigal stated in his opening remarks, what we'd like to do is present this as an order to the Commission to the extent there are no substantial objections, and have the Commission maybe consider it at its next meeting, so that for things in this order that are operational and operational staff needs to get working on, we could proceed on that while the Commission dealt with the other allocation issues and a final order.
Staff?
That supports that approach with regard to trying to align the various jurisdictions and the language from the various jurisdictions. It's not an easy process. I believe that joint applicants have put forth a process that will work. The order that they would like you to consider would be dealing with non-financial terms, and I don't believe it's going to be contentious. But as I believe one of the joint applicants counsel stated earlier, I think it was Mr. Shelley, need to get the non-financial commitments started, and it may take us a while to get a final order to the Commission that ties all this up. Thank you.
Public advocate.
Thank you, Mr. Examiner. Just so the Commission is clear, this primarily relates to the ring fencing requirements. As you know, there were several ring fencing requirements the Commission approved in the amended settlement agreement, but there were additional ones approved as a result of what happened in Maryland and District of Columbia. And the staff and the DPA wanted those additional requirements incorporated into the ring fencing provisions in Delaware.
Denrick?
We have no comments.
Merrick? Dr. Firestone?
No comment.
Chesapeake?
No comment.
Any questions from any commissioner?
Yes, I have one question. So thanks to everyone for the time as well as the energy and effort to put these agreements on the table and present them to the Commission. And Mr. Chair, I'm struggling a little bit because I see more or less two categories of consideration before the Commission, and maybe someone will fix and correct me if I'm wrong. With respect to the language of approving the amended the merger agreement, we now have in front of us a revised amended merger agreement. And if I recall, there were only 3 commissioners as a quorum to oversee and approve the first merger agreement. And now there are changes to the language, and we haven't discussed it. I don't know if we're going to discuss changes to the language today or consider it some other time. But I'm just curious, as a process, do we move forward with this as one commission, 5 commissioners, even though only 3 approved the original agreement? Or do we move through the language with 3 commissioners and through the allocation with 5? Someone help me.
Well, let me start with the revised settlement language because I believe that was attached as an exhibit to the comments provided by Mr. Chow. That was illustrative to show you how the language changes that staff was proposing might be reflected in a revised settlement agreement. It had not been signed off on by anybody. It was more of an illustration of what kinds of changes might need to be made to the amended settlement agreement. With regard to 5 versus 3, perhaps I should defer to whoever is your commission counsel. I have an opinion on it, but maybe you would like to hear from whoever is on the commission at this proceeding.
By the way, Chair, I don't know whether this is a discussion should happen in public session or an executive session. I'd leave that to your discretion.
And also, I just don't want to forget, I think the chair said I could have 5 minutes. I don't think I'll need it, but I would like to be able to answer your question about the allocation issue raised before. Thank you. At the appropriate time.
Commission counsel?
Yeah, I mean, to me, you had a quorum and you made a decision. The fact you have 5 today, I don't think makes a difference. It was still a valid decision when it was made.
As a commissioner, I have some interest to discuss certain elements of those changes in the language. Will there be a forum for that to happen in front of the commission? Not proposing that it should happen today.
I think the answer to that question is whatever the language is agreed upon by the parties will come to us, and if everyone's agreed to the language, I'm sure we'll hear it. You can ask any questions you might, but it's likely that we're going to approve it if all the parties agree that it's appropriate.
If I could just clarify, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner Gray, Mr. Geddes and Mr. McGonigal and I worked on this, but Mr. Geddes and staff prepared a revised amended settlement agreement, and we prepared the form of order. I think they practically say the same thing at this point, so I don't think that anyone's going to be asking you to adopt the revised amended settlement agreement. We think that the order takes care of all the non-financial terms that we're asking about. As Ms. Iori pointed out, a lot of it is ring fencing, but there's some reporting requirements and some other things that staff and DPA appropriately wanted us to do here. So we think that we'll be presenting you with an order that is not opposed by any party and including not opposed by any settling party. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hearing's here. Can we hear from Mr. Geddes on that issue?
Yes, Mr. Geddes.
I don't disagree with what Mr. Trump said with regard to that. These are process issues, and we will endeavor to make sure that it's as efficient as it can be. But there will be a need for some interim order before a final order comes.
I had intended you to answer the question I asked earlier that you needed time. I wasn't maybe clear on that. So
could I have just like a minute? I need to talk to somebody who's not.
Yeah, yes.
Could we take a 10-minute break? Let's take a 10-minute break.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.